Ladies and gentlemen, this is Luke Johnson and Robert Schut. I am at the marvelous Russ Library in Leesburg, Virginia, broadcasting live, and Robert is in Sacramento. Robert, today is what? Our 12th installment of Soren Kierkegaard. Soren Kierkegaard's philosophical fragments. Let's talk about it. We are talking about the 5th chapter, so let's go. Let's get into it.
Okay, today we're going to talk about the disciple at second hand, and we'll kind of give a little explanation of what that means as we go through this. So he starts off the chapter and he says, let's assume that 1,843 years have passed from the time of the contemporary disciple. And of course, if we're counting, that's would be, let's say, 1843, which is just about the time that he's publishing this book. So if you could kind of catch on to his point here. So now, what do we mean by a second-hand disciple? It's kind of an unusual term. So probably never been referred to that as before. It's not, first of all, it's not a contemporary one. So it's a kind of a term in contrast to a contemporary disciple is one who's there during the events, but one who hears the story about the teacher from someone else at a later time would be second-handed. And he's also kind of throwing in the idea of time lapse here, that it's like a generation maybe away. That's why he gets to 1,843 years. So it's not just the story being retold, but there's a period of time that's passing by as well.
And what we'll find out in this chapter is that there isn't just a monolithic group of secondhand disciples, that they could, although Kierkegaard's not going to obsess on the differences all that much, right? That there are many species of secondhand disciples, right?
Absolutely.
There would be those who were moved by 70 years and those were moved by 500 years and so on and so on and so on, right?
Right. So he asks if it's actually a legitimate question to even think about. Is there really a difference between them? I mean, should we waste our time discussing it? And at this point, he says, yes, we ought to. We need to discuss this issue. But then, like Luke was saying, he begins to think, is it right that we should really divide this only between two different parts? Between the first-handed ones right after the contemporary period and us today, and then just look at the extremes, because the first-hand experience and the next 843 years later would be the extremes of that. Think of all the second-hand experience that happened in between, all the generations that told and retold the story, how many times it was told till they finally got to 1843. And now, of course, we're in 2016, so we can even add some more iterations onto that story. Now, of course, one of the things he doesn't say in my own words here is that we have to consider that we do have a record that tracks back to the 1st century. But he's not really addressing that to say, well, we have scriptures of the New Testament. So it's almost like we're the first generation because we're getting the story right from that period, just not through the actual natural iteration of conversation. But we'll adjust this later as well. I'm just bringing it up now in case you're thinking about that. Yeah. In this case, we're really dealing with the idea of being further away from the immediate or the contemporary in time. Does this have anything to do with the ability to have faith in the historical event? This is the question he wants to address. Simply because time is passing by and you're hearing the story second-hand, third-hand, fourth-hand, fifth-hand, does it matter what elements change? And he starts with his section 1. He divides this into 2 sections. So section 1 is the class of disciples at second hand considered with respect to the difference comprised within it. In other words, he's lumping everything together here, but he's trying to discuss, are there any differences within this lump of generations? We're not going to reflect upon the relations between the contemporary and the second-handed disciple here, but only the differences between the whole class of secondhand. And what he's getting at there is we've already in earlier chapters, chapter 4, 3, 2, we've talked about the difference between the contemporary and then the non-contemporary. He says, we're done with that. We're just going to talk about the people who got the message indirectly way back in the first century to those today. And we can either think 1843 or we can think 2016. The answer is going to be the same thing for us.
Well, yeah, you could make the case because, you know, what's interesting is that people, I think, would naturally think, and I hope we address this in our discussion, is that the further you get from the historical event, the more corrupted the story becomes. But that Kierkegaard doesn't see it that way. Like, it's not this massive game of historical telephone. He actually thinks that the further you are away from the gods coming into existence, that gives you some sort of advantage, not a disadvantage.
Well, yeah, he kind of levels it out as we go through. We're going to see him level the playing field between them and between us. But it's interesting how he does this. And I can also throw in a little bit of my theological background here.
Please. I love it when you do that.
How that helps a little bit as well. How it affected me, what I thought, what went through my mind as he approached the argument here. So when we think of the changes from the immediate contemporary until 1843 in increments, he says, are we in danger of creating a Sorites? Now, I've been mispronouncing that word as Sorites because it just feels better to say the word that way, but the actual pronunciation is Sorites. And remember, this is when we create a paradox showing the difficulty when we try to prove something that an actual change takes place through the process of small increments, showing that there's really no absolute time that you can say, okay, now the change takes place. So it's kind of a sophistic argument to say, well, actually, since you can't prove that the change took place anywhere in that gradual gradation, that means no change actually did take place. So he's saying, no, we're not going to really deal with that. Right. We're not entering into that. He says entering into that is pointless to try to determine that. Today everyone see, and again in my own words, when he said that, it kind of clued me in that I think a lot of people are stuck there. A lot of people, I think, have heard that argument, that paradox, and they see that argument everywhere. And they say, hey, this is an interesting argument. I can use this argument about a Sorites so that I don't have to make any decisions. I don't have to make a commitment because I can show that there really is no change, that there really is nothing taking place here. So I've been exposed to people who kind of try to protect themselves from that kind of world of commitment by saying, well, there really is no truth, because if you take it and you divide it up and you divide it up again, you wind up with infinite divisions, and therefore you really don't have anything to determine. So Kierkegaard says, okay, let's avoid all that kind of argumentation. So let's compare opposites. So let's take the opposites and set them beside one another for the sake of comparison. And that's a good way to compare things. You know, a lot of times we do that to see, you know, like with colors. You want to see different. You don't want to see something so close to it that you can really not recognize the difference between. Well, like on a color wheel, that might be a good argument for Sorites. If you take each graduation of color change from red to yellow, and you can show that it's so almost incredibly infinite that slow change takes place. How do you ever prove that red can evolve into yellow? You know, so this is kind of an explanation of maybe how it would work if you try to divide things up into small pieces. But no, let's not do that. Let's just look at red and let's look at yellow. Let's look at the extremes and let's see if we can generate some information from that.
Well, what's interesting is that doing this comparison of opposites and doing the Sorites or whatever, I not to give away too much, is that I think we're going to ultimately end up in the same place, right?
Yeah. Pretty much. I think we will.
That ultimately the distinctions might be arbitrary. But I steal your thunder. Go ahead.
Okay, no, that's okay. So he sets up this contrast. He says, let's take the first century secondary disciples. Not the contemporary, just to make sure we know, it's not the contemporary disciples. It's not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's the people who read the first copies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's the people Paul went out to and told the story to. So they're almost like a generation removed from the, if we use Christ as the teacher, and we usually do, it just kind of gives you an idea. Those are the second-hand disciples.
And Bob, I think this would be a good opportunity for you to insert some of your theological training. Was it not the case that Jesus kind of conferred the ability for some of the apostles to practice miracles even after his death? Did that happen? So that these disciples at secondhand would have been able to see something miraculous, though they may not have witnessed the resurrection of Jesus Christ himself?
Yes. This was the gift of the Holy Spirit that came to the early church, the first century church, that gave them very special privileges, very special powers of prayer, powers of miracle. The miracles weren't always given just to every disciple, though. It was given to Peter and Paul, at least as the evidence shows us, that they were given those powers to get the church.
What sort of things were they able to do? I like, what would be an example of that?
Well, healing was an example, probably the biggest example. I don't think that they ever, it might be arguable whether they actually revived people from death or not, but there was an incident where someone fell out of, you may remember in Acts, someone fell out of a window and they fell down, they appeared to be dead, and Paul went down, he prayed over him, and then he got back up again. So people argue, well, he really wasn't dead, but again, it's a question of what kind of power did Paul have.
Did this ability to practice miracles, did it fall away after the apostles expired, or did that or was it passed on in any other way?
Well, that's a real difficult question to answer. That's very argumentative. There are people today who claim that they have the powers of healing.
That's true.
That people have, passed along through the apostles and so forth. Apostolic, I think it's called apostolic generation.
Secession.
Yeah.
Something like that, right? Yeah.
Something like that as well. And also the miracles as well, that they were able to somehow pass along that. I've never seen any. I've been in churches who believed that. I've never really witnessed any. And so I would have to say, through my own eyes, I've never seen it. I'm not going to say it's not possible. Just through my own eyes, I've never seen it. As far as we know, the information shows after the first generation of apostles died, the miracles died as well. That's what the kind of the evidence shows that, but I'm not going to say that's, that there can't be something else going on out there as well. That doesn't stop.
Yeah, so these disciples at the second hand would have been able to see they would have had their attention aroused by the apostles and the retellings of the story of Jesus and stuff like that, that they would be perhaps more aware of something than, say, we are in 2016 or individuals in 1843, right? And this feeds into the whole point of what advantage the first generation of secondary disciples may have. And I'll let you kind of elaborate on that. But I thought that was a really fascinating digression. I just had to ask because I very rarely have someone with your knowledge to ask that of.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Well, I just want to clarify also, that does not mean because those kinds of miracles, let's say, ceased, it doesn't mean that I don't pray for people who are sick. It doesn't mean that I don't give my devout prayers to somebody in hopes that they would get better. Because I think I'm not going to say that falls under the classification of miraculous. I lay my hands on somebody and then instantly they get out of their deathbed. But what I mean is, it's my obligation. If I love an individual, I pray for that individual. I pray for their sicknesses. So it's an expression of my love. I'm not looking for miracles. It's just an expression of my love for somebody.
And I've heard, and whether or not it's true, this could be an old wives' tale. I've heard about old, clinical studies where they've had people pray for certain people with terminal diseases or very sick, and those individuals started compared to the control group did so well that they had to stop the experiment. So I don't know if there's any truth in that. That might be something that just gets passed around through the grapevine. But, if that falls under the miraculous, maybe things like that still happen today.
Yeah, I don't exclude it. And like I say, I have a hope that they happen for the people that I love. I would love to see the people that are sick or crippled get up and walk. I mean, I would, give anything to have that ability to make people that are crippled get up and walk. I don't have it, and I've never seen it take place. So, but I keep praying for them anyway, regardless. Okay, so we have now part A under section 1, the first generation of secondary disciples. So when we speak of the first generation of secondhand disciples, we speak of those who are nearer to the occasion. It gives us a reliable account because historically they were closer. But we have to consider that not everyone saw everything and repeated it accurately. Now, this is my insertion here. So when we think about people in the first generation, should we jump to the conclusion that what they knew, that what Paul told them, what Peter told them, and what they told other people was totally accurate? No, I don't think we can jump to that conclusion that the second and third hand people received the information as accurately, perhaps, as we have it today, because they received it in pieces. It was given to a community, and it was up to the community of believers to maintain the accuracy, the credibility, and the integrity of the gospel. And what we have today is we have groups called textual critics who examine the Bible in my experience, mostly in the Greek, in the New Testament. They examine it in the Greek, and they decipher and translate the languages of the first and the second-hand disciples. So this brings us, in the sense, the text was written all the way back. So we have that connection directly back to the first and second-hand disciples. And that all the second-hand disciples received the most accurate version of the gospel. Many of us today actually probably know more about what happened than some of those isolated communities, because we're able to get more reports, compile them, and fill in the time gaps. Like we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we have Acts to speak historically. Not to mention the letters of Paul, which he gives out certain historical events and certain ideas in the community. But the Bible was really a luxury. The New Testament is a luxury to modern man. The first and second generation, they really didn't have Bibles to pass out as freely as we have. So they had to depend more on the stories that transpired. So as we'll see here, it's an illusory advantage to think that the immediate, well, the way I have my sentence worded, let me read it directly because there's a play on words that Kierkegaard uses here. He says, nearer is an illusory advantage because being near the immediate certainty or proximity is not the same as being immediately certain, which I had to deal with those. So I'm thinking, what is he trying to say between immediate certainty and immediately certain? And the best I can come to it is that immediate certainty is a proximity, being there, being able to observe it, see it, more maybe in the sensual arena, as opposed to having immediately certain, meaning I have a confidence that what happened happened. So that's kind of how I see his little play on words. Did you catch on to that? Can you add anything to that, Luke?
I could. I was looking up those studies on on prayer because I wanted to check and I have some information that I'd like to share about it. But can you ask the question one more time? Oh, okay.
He plays with words here. He said, I'll read the sentence once more. He says, nearer is an illusory advantage because being near the immediate certainty is not the same thing as immediately certain. And the way I clarified it is the first term, I got the sense that he was speaking about immediate certainty was someone who stands right before the event. It's more of a proximity in time and perhaps even in location.
Right. They can see it with their eyes, just like they have the immediate certainty of the star in the sky before them, right? But then like what the uncertainty is going to be we talked about this earlier before, how like people who were contemporaneous with Christ, even though they could touch him and see all the miracles and stuff like that, they were still uncertain that he claimed to be what he was, right? And that's where you've got to go further. That's where you have to have the will to believe. It's not that having the historical certainty makes you any more certain. Obviously, Judas sold him out. What Peter denied him 3 times, right? Like none of this, they weren't automatically convinced just because they broke bread with him.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Does that clarify things?
Yeah.
Does that help?
Yeah.
Can I add my little thing about the prayer studies?
That's right.
So I had 2 conflicting news sources. I looked up something in the New York Times, and from 2006, there was some study where, and it gets really into the weeds, but they looked at how prayer affected individuals who were undergoing heart surgery, and it looked like that prayer actually had an adverse effect on those individuals in this New York Times article. I just skimmed it because the numbers are actually really tricky when they start to break down the control groups who was told they were prayed for. That individuals who were told that they were being prayed for might have had a higher expectation that they would be healed, and when it didn't happen, there may be more physical complications. And then I looked up something from Newsmax from 2015. Obviously, Newsmax comes at journalism very differently than the New York Times. These are very different sources. And they interviewed a religious scholar who had a great understanding of these medical things. And one of the things that he said is, there's a 7-year difference in life expectancy between those who never attend church and those who attend weekly. And further, this article says the American Journal of Public Health studied nearly 2,000 older Californians for 5 years and found that those who attended religious services were 36% less likely to die during that period than those who didn't. So long and the short of it is that there is conflicting evidence on the power of prayer in medical situations. And Kierkegaard probably would have wanted it that way because it makes the decision for Christ all that more uncertain.
Yeah.
If we had empirical evidence saying that it was, proved, or we could weigh your body and we could determine how much the soul weighed when it left your body or whatever, then you wouldn't believe these things with the passionate interiority of subjective truth.
Yeah, it's so hard. How would you ever have a control group where you would know the only difference is they go to church and don't go to church?
All right.
There's so many variables in that formula. Like certain churches, they eat better because they have more healthier food because it's part of their religious beliefs. Right. That would certainly be one of those variables entering into it. So that kind of stuff is interesting to listen to, but right?
It's interesting. I don't know. I find it as interesting as like listening to people's near-death experiences.
Yeah.
I find them to be really riveting, but I don't know how much they really tell us that in the end.
True.
I don't know if you ever do that, listen to people's near-death experiences or people retell them or whatever, or like a little boy who dies and goes to heaven and talks to Jesus.
It's funny. Sometimes people in my Bible study class, they'll come in with these little snippets out of the newspaper or something, and then they'll ask me for an opinion on it. And so, I have to kind of do a little research there just to be able to give them a good answer. So, yeah, I do run across those kind of little news pieces every once in a while.
Yeah.
So let me continue on here. He says that, and even in the immediate, there is no certainty. We're only closer to it, and we still need the condition. So his whole point of view is, you can be as close, you can be talking Jesus face to face and look into his blue eyes, and it's not going to really be an advantage because you don't have the condition yet. You need the condition. Right. That's the whole thing. He's building this upon. If a disciple had the most accurate, the fullest account, would that make him a disciple? No. If we made the historical as an object of faith, it would be misdirected. So then
Josephus would have been a disciple, right?
Yeah, right, right. He was a contemporary, and he wrote about John the Baptist and about Jesus, and he had all the information there, and he even had the people to interview if he needed. And actually, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I have my own theories about Josephus. I am not positive he wasn't a Christian, a
Oh,
closet
really?
Christian. Yeah, yeah,
You know,
because you had,
there are a lot of people that say, you know, the thing is with Josephus, a lot of people who want to deflate the authenticity of
yes.
Christianity cite Josephus. So this would be an interesting theory. I think it's worth hearing. I'll field it. Yeah,
Well, real
let's hear it.
quickly, I got to thinking, what was his religious um, beliefs? What did he have offered to him? Well, he was exiled. You know, the Jews hated Josephus because he kind of was a traitor. He was supposed to die and offer himself as a sacrifice along with all the other soldiers. I forgot the war that he was in. But instead, when he was the last one left, he didn't kill himself. He didn't commit suicide. He left. And because of that, the Romans took him in, and he became a historian for the Romans. So it became really close to the people who were trying to wipe out the Jews. And so that puts him at a very difficult place religious-wise. He really couldn't go and worship in the temple at the time that it was still there. And I can't imagine the Jews taking very warmly to him. So what did he have? I mean, it seems like Christianity at that time, which was really a segment of Judaism, would have welcomed him, because they welcomed a lot of Roman soldiers and Romans into the faith. And so it seemed
Right.
like he had a place to go, which was almost the same thing as being a Jew at that time. So I saw Christianity as a great opportunity for Josephus. So I'm not ready to say he was not a Christian. I can't say he was, but I'm not ready to exclude him from possibly being a Christian.
Why did so many
Especially,
people why did so many people use him as an argument against the authenticity of Christ? Because he records so little of him?
well, I think that people who don't want him, they feel more comfortable him not being a Christian, because that way the things he said positive about John the Baptist and Christ, it's a lot easier to say they were inserted by Christians rather than he actually said it. But the insertion, we have to remember, the earliest documents we have of Josephus contain this very information about Christ, positively speaking about Christ. He says, we can't even call, he was such a man that we can't even call him a man. He was beyond being a man, and wrote about John the Baptist also in very positive light. So whether they were inserts or not, we don't have any real information to tell us to prove they were insertions, nor to prove he wasn't a Christian.
You should write a book on that one day. I have a feeling there'd be a lot of people who would buy that book.
Well, I don't know enough about the story, but that's what I do know about the story. I'm not convinced he wasn't a Christian. I'll just leave it at that. That's just kind of my own.
I think it's
my
an
own
interesting
little
theory.
personal take.
Yeah.
So a validation. Now he goes into validation of the historical to shorten his dialogue for the sake of space. Now he writes this really complex little piece. I don't know how many paragraphs. I think it's about a whole page or 2 pages long. And it's just so easy to get lost in it. I thought what I would do is kind of distill it down into what I got out of it. So rather than deal with the intricacies of it, to shorten his dialogue for the sake of space and time, I'd say that his point is that the gospel stories, or the stories that we have received, don't appear to be the story of liars. For there's many points of agreement and many points of overlap as evidence of those who tell the truth. So he tries to go about stories and compare stories that are told by people who tell the truth compared to people who are convicts and liars. And like I said, I want to spare everybody from this because it's a little vague and a little difficult to follow. But the idea is that the stories that we get from the New Testament are not like stories told by liars. And to kind of defend that point of view, we do have other stories from the first century that tell us about Christ that are obviously lies, and that they're obviously fictional. Our Gospels are not such stories when we compare them to some of those other Gospels. We have the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Peter, and many. There's about 1,000, I think that at last I counted them as over 1,000 different writings we have of the first century that are Christian. And numerous of these Gospels, and they're called Gnostic Gospels. And when you read them in comparison to the four Gospels, you'll see why we consider them fictional. One of the things is that truth does have gaps and difficulties. And if we had the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, word for word in every particular place, it would be much more suspicious that there was some kind of collusion between them, and that they were based on a fictional story. This happens because observation, well, the reason we have different stories is because observation can be distorted and no one sees everything. Now, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they do have certain pieces that are word for word, certain pieces where they tell the same story, but other pieces where they tell the story differently because there's different eyewitnesses. And this is really evidence of truth, not evidence of collusion and fiction and lies. And it's these differences that actually give witness to truth. Because fabrications would have been smoothed out through the years to remove all the difficult sayings and stories, leaving us with the most reasonable faith to believe. So that's my biggest argument when people argue about the idea of the obvious fictionality of the Gospels. Is I'd say, well, wait a second. You know, are they really written like fictional books? Why are there so many difficult things that Christ says? And if they were fictional, why do we have these apparent conflicts? And why is there so much arguing of doctrine? Wouldn't they be smoothed out by this time if the churches were really trying to collude? But they're not smoothed out. They're very rough, especially people aren't really exposed to the Greek. And when you read them in the Greek, you'll find they're a lot rougher than they are in the translations. Just because every time you translate, you smooth it out a little bit. And so when you go from the Greek to the English, you can't help but to get the translator's voice, the voce, I think it's called, the voice in it. So we have to be really careful.
So what you're saying, yeah. If we look at the conflicts between the Gospels of the New Testament, you know, who discovered the tomb and who was there when Jesus appeared and this and stuff like that. It's probably the veracity of it we get a sense of its veracity because of the fragmentary nature, much like if there's like, I don't know, a crime committed and you get like 30 different people sort of reporting slightly different aspects of the same thing. And then like the truth sort of emerges as a result of putting all the stories together. Is it kind of like that? Whereas it would be suspicious if 30 people saw the same thing and there weren't discrepancies. It would almost seem like it was scripted. Is that kind of like that, that someone told everybody what to say? Is that kind of what
exactly that part? And there's different ways to resolve it. Like when you read, let's say Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're called the synoptics, and you have each one tells the same story, but they tell it slightly differently. So now, as the reader or the interpreter, you have a job. Am I going to harmonize these stories and see if I can make them all fit? Okay, or am I going to say one is a little bit more credible than the other two, so I'm going to pick this one? So, you know, you have to decide, am I going to massage the stories and make them work, or am I going to pick one and say this is the right way and the other two might have got it a little bit wrong? And that's my responsibility as how I'm going to see the story. And that's kind of like my bottom line here is that each of us has to take the responsibility and decide whether they believe the story is to be true and how we believe it to be true. But we, not like a lot of people that I've run into, is just kind of off the top of your head blow out a theory, which is what a lot of people feel free to do. Do your homework. You know, try to study the Greek, learn the language, make an informed decision as to what's really being said here. Don't just read one or two copies in English and say, oh, I got it now. This is the answer, you know. It's a lot harder to do than that. And so you got to give these translators, you know, their due compliments and their privileges for changing things. So read different versions. If you can't learn the Greek, read different versions at least. They have parallel Bibles where you can read actually I have one that has 8 different versions. And so if I don't understand it in one, I can compare it to another, to another, to another.
I'm sure people, you know, I look at, you know, I frequently look up Bible verses and I see that there are like 30 different versions of the Bible, which other than the King James, what are your preferred translations?
Well, there's the New English translation was one of the most newest, which does a lot of smoothing out. So you have to be a little careful. There's a lot more of the editor in there than I'm always comfortable with, but it's a good place to start. Like if you're going to read and you want modern English, the NIV, the New International Version is probably one of the most popular because it's somewhere in between the two. And sometimes the King James even is good. New King James is good. The Revised Standard Version, they really each one offers something different. So it's kind of hard to pick one of them. The NIV is probably the most popular. You might want to start there and see what that does for you. Okay.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's important to know because, like, someone for me, you know, working on this internet company, like I gravitate towards, you know, just what's in the public domain. But outside of that, I mean, I could see the differences when I put them side by side.
Yeah, anything, if you're just reading it, any version is probably good. But if you want to read and you want to decide on a doctrine, to who's right, you know, you want to decide, are the people knocking on my door telling me I'm all wrong? What do they got to say? Maybe I better look a little deeper. Then you got to do a little more homework. You got to do a little more research and go to other versions. For the most part, just reading pretty much any version is okay.
Good.
So I wouldn't be hung up about that. So the second-hand disciple is not telling us what God said, but what someone said that God said. So we're one iteration removed here. So he's always going to be faced with this self-contradiction of how do I prove this happened in history? So we were talking, I think one of our listeners brought up something about how does Kierkegaard feel about the historical? So we kind of enter into that a little bit here. How does he feel about the historical? Well, there's always going to be some kind of a self-contradiction. Always going to be doubt, historical doubt, but how much do we let that influence us? Do we just say, oh, well, there's doubt, so I'm never going to make a decision? He doesn't take that tact. But the picture of how Kierkegaard feels historically. Yeah, there's always going to be that element of doubt, historically speaking, if we just take history in the raw. Then he talks about reflection of sin, of which I'm going to read page 116, just about the center of the page here. He's got a statement. Teacher must first develop in the learner the most profound self-reflection, the sense of sin, as a condition for the understanding. So there, I read that because he pulls together a whole bunch of things in that little paragraph. He pulls together the idea of the teacher, the learner, self-reflection, sin, and the condition. So it's probably, of all the paragraphs, of all the sections he's written in this book, this one pulls together probably the most. So he tells us about this condition again. He brings up the condition as the main factor involved. Reflection upon sin is the condition that brings about faith. Man finds himself as a sinner because perfection has been revealed to him as the perfect God. So we have all this taking place in this self-reflection, this sin, this realization of sin within this self-reflection, and so forth, all creating a dynamic. The miracle does not make us believe, but merely creates, he calls it an occasion, but I felt, what does he really mean by an occasion here? I mean, it could kind of go in different directions. What I took it to mean was an opportunity. So
Yes.
I would say that the miracle does not make us believe, but merely creates an opportunity to believe. Right? So you kind of confer with that?
Yeah, like I try to think of it kind of like, you know, if one of those miracles or whatever kind of grabs your attention, so then you can enter into the relationship and have the perfection of the God revealed to you. Because I'm not really sure what in the physical instantiation reveals the perfection of Christ. I'm not sure it's empirical or outward in any way, right? Because miracles could, by inference, could easily be performed by the devil, right? I mean, or some kind of demon or something like that. And I'm sure we've talked about this at some point in our entire, our discussion of Soren Kierkegaard's philosophical fragments. But where do we learn about the perfection of Christ? And it seems to be in that moment where we invite him into our hearts. Or do you think the perfection is more discernible before we make that existential move?
Well, in my overall reading of Kierkegaard, I've tried to kind of formulate or distill an idea. Well, what does it say to me? How does it happen? And what I've come to is and this actually falls into a lot of Luther as well. There's absolute, and although it's offensive to us, that makes it all the more. That makes it all the more believable because it's offensive. There's nothing I can do to make that moment happen.
Right.
There's nothing I can do to say, okay, I'm ready now, God, let it happen. And nothing happens.
Well, you have to make it happen. Like the individual the individual has to has to be prepared to acknowledge their sin and their need for healing, right?
Well, you see,
for atonement.
It goes back to Kierkegaard here. He's telling us that what's he called it again? I always forget this word. Not the occasion.
The moment, the Augenblick.
The moment is not something that's within us. You see, this moment is not within us. It's not something we can just let it out and make it happen. The moment is in God. But it's not just in him like something separate. It's who God is. And so God is always radiating himself into reality. He's always being God. He's always being perfect. He's always being righteous. He's always being loving. He's always being, that righteous individual. So it's not that righteousness is in us. It's that when we come to recognize it in God, that's the moment.
Well, so I would say it seems like a moment to us. It seems it seems like an epiphany to us, but from the eternal perspective, it's always been happening.
Yes.
It only seems like an Augenblick to the individual who's finally taken God up on the invitation. It's like, oh, okay. But it was.
Yeah, I think you've hit on what is behind a lot of my own personal theology, and that's that we have a lot of it is our perception of God, as we have to distinguish from God himself. What we perceive of God isn't perhaps exactly who God is, but it's our perception that's being developed through our ideas, through our relationship with God. Kierkegaard deals with this a little bit more, like I say, a little bit later, but he also kind of gives us little pieces of it. And that's why I tried to distill it and tried to put it together. And that's the best I can come to for now, as far as how I feel about our role in the matter here anyway.
Sure.
So let's see, we go back to miracles here now. Actually, we're going to deal a little bit what you brought up earlier. The miracle does not make us believe, but merely creates that opportunity to believe the occasion. It's only the believer who will believe in the miracle. Non-believers require more and more evidence, more and more miracles, which witness that they don't believe and cannot believe. So actually, Paul says this in one of, I can't remember which one, was it Corinthians, I believe he says, that the miracles are really evidence of the non-believer, not of the believer. And I'm kind of making that point a little differently here, because people who don't believe will always find alternative explanations for the miracles.
Do you think that's true? Do you? Because there are so many people who said they would just believe if they had a sign. I tend to think that they're being real. They're being authentic about that. Like if they.
I think they believe it themselves. Yeah, I think they're authentic in the sense that they believe that if somebody before their eyes was able to levitate themselves, that they would believe that that's the perfect person. But then if they saw them, then they might think, yeah, but maybe it was a trick. I don't know. It could be a trick. Or better yet, what the Pharisees thought here, what if Christ were the devil and his miracles were just deceptive lies? Many Pharisees actually believed that. And actually, I myself entertained that possibility. And I said, in questioning my own personal belief, I thought, how do I know I'm right? How do I know Jesus is really the Messiah and he's the Son of God? What if he were hiding, masquerading as the Son of God? And this is what's actually called the unforgivable sin.
Well, the Sermon on the Mount, a house divided can't stand, right?
That's right. That's right. There's no really good answer or good defense to make actually from this idea of Christ being the devil. But what we know is it's called the unforgivable sin because it's committing a sin against the very essence of God, the very Spirit of God and who he is. If we can't recognize God, even when he stands before us in the Christ, then our hearts have become so hard that even God's love can't penetrate. So if we were to see and hear the Sermon on the Mount and say, oh no, these are the words of the devil, then we've become so hardened that God can't possibly say anything any better. I mean, what is God going to say if the Sermon on the Mount isn't good enough?
It's pretty hard to top. I went back and I read it recently, a couple of months ago. It is so deep and so beautiful, and it is one of the most beautiful things ever recorded.
To think that a group of men got together in a grass hut and said, "Hey, let's come up with a sermon and put it in the mouth of Christ." Man, if they did that, more power to them, because they've got me fooled.
Yeah, it's really good. I highly recommend anyone taking the time to go back and read it for themselves. And where is
that? Where will they find that?
Oh, I believe I made a recording of it for the Noetic app and website, and so you can download and listen to that. But it's the Gospel of Matthew, and but there are also many other places that have it much more professionally read. I'm sure you can get a version of Charlton Heston reading it if you feel like you need to be moved that much more. I am no Charlton Heston when it comes to voice acting. Pretty nasally. Actually.
Yeah. Well, okay, then we continue on here. It's in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7 if you want to read it for yourself. But Luke's version is very well done too. So we talk about the same offense. Each generation exhibits the same proportion of offense as the first generation did. For there's no immediacy closer. Each individual must be confronted with the offense. So he's putting us on equal ground here, Luke, by telling us it's not whether you are closer in time. It's not whether your version of the Bible is better. It's not whether, you've actually heard Charlton Heston read it or heard Bob Schut read it. It's nothing to do with that. It's got to do with the condition which each of us has equal access to, which is the very brought about, as I said, by the very being of God. And I want to make this emphasize that the condition isn't something separate from the being of God. It's God's presence. That's the condition. So it's not like you can get the condition, separately, and then decide whether you want to get together with God or whether you've got the right condition. There's only one condition because there's only one God. And so it's identical with who God is. It's our perception of God, as Luke brought out. The first generation is nearer to the impact and the consequence of the event. During that time, it might have appeared to be an advantage, but as we'll see, as Kierkegaard will take us, it's only an illusory advantage. Okay, now we go to part B. How are we doing on time, Luke? Okay, we got to go to part B.
So far, so good, man.
Okay, he calls this the last generation, which would be his generation here, or our generation now. This generation is far removed from the initial encounter and its consequences that we must consider. So he's using another word, consequences, and I'm thinking, what does he mean? Because usually when we think of consequences, we think about something bad, right? At least I do. What's the consequence? My mother and father said, okay, the consequences of your behavior are, you usually end up in a physical contact of sorts. So I decided I better not go down that road. So to me, consequences usually mean something bad, but he doesn't mean it that way here. Consequences means the effects of that we have to consider, the effects of the encounter. So did you take it that way too, Luke, or am I making a big deal out of the word consequences?
Yeah, I mean, I think broadly it falls under the effects of the encounter, but I kind of thought they're positive in nature. I think he thinks that as time goes on, that there is, and I don't want to preempt you, that as time goes on, there's a naturalization of the reverberations of this shock into the world. And what was so radical to believe as a gospel at the second hand or as a contemporary becomes normalized, becomes ubiquitous, and becomes actually really easy to comprehend, so that the disciple that is further away may actually have it easier in some respect, may have it, but we'll come to see that advantage is also illusory.
Right. Yeah, so we're going to talk about the effects on how, whether or not they can become inherited by the next generation and so forth and so on, so that the last generation actually winds up with an accumulation of all these advantages. So we'll see if that's really true. See, then he uses another term, which I'm going to have to define, called the probability of faith. And I think what he means here by the probability is what's more likely to happen, or what's maybe most likely to happen, not too far apart from what it ought to mean to us, or it means most of the time. But we'll discuss probability in a little while here. Faith is by no means partial to probability. In other words, even though something might be probable as far as being possible, it really doesn't affect faith. Because faith is not always what is probable. That's why it becomes offensive. And that's why faith is different. It's not believing in what's the most likely. That would be counterintuitive to faith. Sometimes faith makes us believe what's most unlikely.
Right.
So
that's
he's
why
showing a distinction.
Yeah. That's why the naturalizations of the consequences of that event are going to be bad on some level, right? Because it makes faith more probabilistic. It makes it seem more certain than it actually is. We talked about how the past may give the feeling of eternity and certainty, but as we explored in the previous installments, we know that's not the case. That it's just as ambiguous as the future is. It's just what set of circumstances are we willing to believe? All right. We just may not know that we're willing to believe a certain set of circumstances. We're just passing it down.
Right. Right. And then he tells us that the bottom line is because the paradox is really improbable. It's not something we can enter into the world of reason because you can't reason it out. But that's kind of like the bottom line here, is that it doesn't enter into the probabilities because a paradox is not something probable. It's something beyond.
Yeah. And the whole point of what Kierkegaard's trying to do, I'm sorry to interrupt you. The whole point of what Kierkegaard's trying the whole point of what Kierkegaard's trying to do is to emphasize the improbability of that paradox. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with this anecdote, but when he turned 30 years old, he was living in this increasingly industrialized age. He was entering into modernity, and he was like, I'm not a man of genius that can make life easier for anyone. And he was sitting on a park bench, and he's like, well, what am I good at? He's like, well, I'm good at making things harder for everyone. and that's precisely the whole thrust of his project, is to dramatize and make the paradox that much more improbable, to make it fight against those naturalized consequences that have been handed down to the generation that's alive in 1843 and to those of us that are alive in 2016, is to renew the radical nature of the crucifixion and the resurrection and the incarnation, how all these qualities are bound up with one another. Had you ever heard that story before?
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
I did. I can't remember which work it was in. Wasn't it in his Becoming an Author? My works is Becoming an Author. I think that's where it was.
It might, in my point of view as an author, it might, or maybe maybe it's in his journals or something like that. You'll and I'll find it one day. Yeah.
It's kind of interesting that you should bring that up. I'll just take just 30 seconds here to tell you. In my Bible study class, it's been a little while since I've reminded them, but I usually open it. I used to open it up and say, most Bible study teachers try to make scripture easier and easier. And I think my job as a Bible study teacher is to make it harder and harder. So I've kind of inherited the baton from Kierkegaard. I don't see myself as always trying to make everything easier to believe. Sometimes I see myself as presenting the paradox, which means it's just going to make it harder to believe. So I probably need to remind them that in our first session of the new year, to let her remind them where they stand. Then he goes into, actually, I'm one of those few people perhaps who reads the footnotes. And Kierkegaard does contain some very valuable footnotes. So if you're reading them, don't just pass beyond them, because some of them are worthwhile reading. I have a note that I from footnote number 1 that I took. And what it means here is that it's foolish to say that the paradox is probable. Rather than spend one's resources trying to prove the paradox, it would be better to simply admit its improbability and declare that you simply believe it. And I think that's what my faith comes down to. Sometimes we get so caught up in arguing the paradox and trying to prove it that it's just easier to say to somebody, look, you don't want to believe in it? Fine. I know it's not provable. I accept that, but I believe in it anyway. And that was his footnote there. And I have another reading to make here. Page 118. He says, "Honored sir, you speak like a fool. Of course it's absurd, as it ought to be. In spite of all objections, which I have thought through myself in a far more terrible shape than anyone else could bring them home to me, in spite of which I have deliberately chosen to believe the improbable. Instead of replying thus, he seeks to bring a probability demonstration to bear." So he's arguing here, and that's under footnote 1, actually. That's why I say it's a valuable piece of information in a footnote. So don't just exclude footnotes as not being worthy to be read or just extra information, because it's just beautifully put there.
Oh, by the way, I think the quote that I was referring to, where Kierkegaard was talking about how he wanted to make things harder, is in the Concluding Unscientific postscript.
Oh, is it?
Can I read it? Because I think it's a especially profound one. Can I read it?
Absolutely, sure. Go ahead.
"I sat and smoked my cigar until I lapsed into thought. You are going on, I said to myself, to become an old man without being anything and without really undertaking to do anything. Wherever you look about you, you see the many benefactors of the age who know how to benefit mankind by making life easier and easier. Some by railways, others by omnibuses and steamboats, others by the telegraph, others by easily apprehended compendiums and short recitals of everything worth knowing, and finally the true benefactors of the age who make spiritual existence and virtue of thought easier and easier, yet more and more significant. And what are you doing? Suddenly this thought flashed through my mind. You must do something, but inasmuch as with your limited capacities it will be impossible to make anything easier than it has become, you must undertake to make something harder. This notion pleased me immensely. I conceived it as my task to create difficulties everywhere.
Yeah, that really spoke to me when I first heard that and read that. That really spoke to me, and I really thought that was what I can do in my church. That there's so many people in Christianity trying to make Christianity easier, that I felt, it's time somebody stood up and says, no, you're making it too easy. It's just too easy, too diluted. It needs to be a stronger potion. And it's going to be hard going down, but that's my job. That's what I'm going to do. And so that's why I say I love that. And thank you for reading that. That was well done. Right up there with Charlton Heston. Okay, we go to consequences now. If the paradox is true, then nothing can change it, even though it might be improbable. The consequences of the paradox, or the effects of the paradox, don't change the paradox. It doesn't work in reverse, as though the consequences could somehow influence the paradox. That the consequences might make it easier, in other words, for future generations, for second-hand disciples in regard to the paradox. So it's not like the first generation, it's really, really hard, really improbable, but they kind of come up with some good explanations of it, and then they pass the paradox out to the next generation, just a little easier. And then they continue to say, well, wait a second, I can improve upon the paradox. I've got some pretty good solutions to it. And then that second generation passes it to the third. And heck, by the time you get to our generation, it's really, really easy. You see, it doesn't work like that. The paradox doesn't change each time it's passed down. Each time it's passed down, it contains the same offense that it did the first time it heard from the mouth of Christ. So having consequences or effects is not an advantage to the immediate, nor to anybody else for that matter. Here, consequences, again, don't appear to be a negative thing where we think of negative consequences, but it's merely the results. The paradox doesn't cause consequences. Rather, in a sense, it is the consequence. It is the effect. So everything is kind of rolled into the paradox. You can't change the paradox, or rather the paradox changes us. It's the fact. And they're most certainly not cumulative for each generation. In other words, they're not something we can pass down. So he uses this term that Luca introduced us to a little earlier called naturalization. And that was another one that took me a while to figure out what he's talking about. And again, here he uses the term first for a while, and then later on he gives us what he means by it. So you have to go back and reread it. He uses it in reference to this passing along, which almost means being born a Christian. As though Christian parents can produce a Christian child. As though somehow the paradox becomes so diluted and so inherited that merely by having offspring, you can have a Christian child. And this, I think, comes about from his experience with the Lutheran Church in Denmark, because it was almost to that point that it was hereditary. The object of faith, which is the paradox, always offers both the faith and the offense. And this is the nature of the paradox. If we say that we're born with faith, we enter into kind of a nonsense statement. You can't be born with the paradox.
This is one of my favorite parts from this reading. He said, being born with faith is like being born 24 years old.
Right.
I love that.
Very, very cleverly put.
And perhaps you should explain that a little bit better, because I think that's a joke that you, me, and Kierkegaard understand. But yeah.
Well, he's going to get to it. I'll kind of let them come to their own conclusion on that. We're going to get into kind of a difficult area for me to explain, maybe, and I usually feel if I can't explain it, then I didn't fully understand it. So I'm going to need your help here to reflect a little bit to see if I captured everything. But that's what I usually use as my red flag or my alarm button. If I can't teach it, then I probably don't really fully understand it. But I called it, my little topic is transmigration. He links the idea of being born with faith, coming back into existence, already have it. And so this is the doctrine of transmigration, which is souls coming back as a person or even an animal. And this was something that Socrates and Plato believed. Aristotle didn't believe it quite this way. He had a different idea. He didn't believe people came back as animals, but as a possibility, that souls could only come back as people. But I don't want to digress.
I would clarify that well, you may know more about the transmigration of souls. I'm not sure Socrates believed in reincarnation that way, and it gets kind of problematic to conflate Plato and Socrates. So I would just add that little caveat.
That's fair. Fair.
And I'm not totally sure if the transmigration of souls works itself out as reincarnation with Plato either. I don't mean to be too disputatious about that. It's just I think it might be a little bit more complicated than that.
Okay, well that's why I wanted you to kind of give me a little feedback on this, because my background on them is just kind of what I've read quickly and what I've heard from listening to other people. But the idea was that let's just say then that Plato had this idea of the transmigration of souls more so than Socrates, so we won't throw it on his plate. We'll say that at least exactly what it was. I heard indirectly through studies of Aristotle what he thought Plato said. So I'll kind of
so Aristotle thought that Plato believed in essentially reincarnation?
Yeah, that they came back as either people or animals, and he thought that was kind of hilarious because the soul couldn't come back as another thing, such as a tree or an animal or a monkey or an elephant or whatever it was that he was using as an example. But yeah, I want to be careful not to misquote other philosophers, but that's my understanding of it somewhat. He didn't.
What's interesting is one of my favorite words capture is this. The transmigration of souls is actually a definition of it. I don't know if you know the word metempsychosis.
No, never heard that one.
It's an incredible word. I learned it from James Joyce's Ulysses. The word metempsychosis is used over and over again. I've got Wikipedia pulled up here real quick. I think it could help just clear it up real quick. Can I read a paragraph real quick?
Yeah, please do. Yeah, I'll learn something.
Yeah. So the real weight and importance of metempsychosis in Western tradition is due to its adoption by Plato. In the eschatological myth, which closes the Republic, he tells the myth how the son of Arminius, miraculously returned to life on the 12th day after death and recounted the secrets of the other world. After death, he said he went with others to the place of judgment and saw the souls returning from heaven and proceeded with them to a place where they chose new lives, human and animal. Okay. He saw the soul of Orpheus changing into a swan, Thamyris becoming a nightingale, musical birds choosing to be men, the soul of Atalanta choosing the honors of an athlete. Men were seen passing into animals, and wild and tame animals changing into each other. After a choice, the soul strength of Lethe then shot away like stars to their birth. There are myths and theories to the same effect in other dialogues, the Phaedrus, Meno, Phaedo, Timaeus, and Laws. In Plato's view, the numbers of souls was fixed. Birth, therefore, is never the creation of a soul, but only a transmigration from one body to another. Plato's acceptance of the doctrine is characteristic of his sympathy with popular beliefs and desire to incorporate them in a purified form into his system. The extent of Plato's belief in metempsychosis has been debated by some scholars in modern times. Marcello Ficino, for one, argued that Plato's reference to metempsychosis were intended allegorically. So,
okay.
does that make things clearer on some level? Or more mysterious?
Well, whether metaphorical or not, it doesn't really matter in our case. We don't really have to make a decision. But
Yeah.
what animal are you coming back as if you had a choice?
I like the idea of a nightingale. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm coming back as one of my cats because they've got the life. They're totally spoiled.
I never thought about it. But it makes me think, Keats has the poem Ode to a Nightingale. I wonder if there's a Platonic reference there. Probably is. If someone in the Republic chose to be a nightingale, is all the stuff. It's a matrix, man.
Yeah, it is funny how it all comes together sometimes.
Yeah.
So anyway, back to Kierkegaard here. So it says that he would die, and the idea that he would die and come back into existence, remembering his pre-existent life. It's not a mere recollection of pre-existence as much as a recollection from another existence. So kind of splitting the hairs between what Kierkegaard was saying as what Kierkegaard was saying that Socrates believed, and what Kierkegaard was saying that Plato believed, I guess we'd have to say, is there's a difference between recollection and transmigration. And recollection was coming back to the world, remembering things. But in transmigration, you actually come back remembering who you were in your previous life. You bring that soul back with you again. And so that's the distinction Kierkegaard is making. Metaphorically or theologically and their beliefs, I can't really say. But hopefully that'll at least split the difference so that we know what we're talking with here. So he brings up the question, can an individual be born with two human natures? My past nature and my present nature, my nature without faith and my nature with faith. In this theory, a person would be born with the nature of faith before they even became a believer, before they had access to the moment. They'd be born with the moment, in other words. So in the Socratic idea, the individual has a pre-existence and recalls things about his pre-existence. But in this other state, he remembers actually being a self and not just the things about his pre-existence. And it does, in that sense, it almost falls under the category of reincarnation, doesn't it? I wouldn't know how to differentiate that kind of transmigration of souls with reincarnation. To me, it would sound pretty similar. Then everything we said earlier becomes confused in both Climacus's method and the Socratic method. If that were true, that a man was born with the condition. Under this idea, one would not be given faith, nor does he even recollect it. He brings it with him. He talks about Apollonius, who wasn't content with remembering his pre-existence, but remembered who he was before he came into existence. Before he even became himself. He remembered his previous life, his identity, and this would create a whole, in Kierkegaard's words, this would create a new race, a monstrosity of people who came back into the world reincarnated or transmigrated as who they were before. And as well as it brings up a whole lot of other questions as well, that if you've ever discussed that with anybody, the possibility of reincarnation, it's quite interesting how it could come about. But back to the consequences here, back to the effects. The consequences don't follow directly as a one-to-one. If we examine the consequences from the outset as a succession of steps, and each generation is related to a step, the only advantage can be seen by means of a conversion. Probably, and this is, I'm not quite sure where he got that logical step there, that conversion would be the only thing that would be an advantage, other than the idea that this would somehow become the best outcome would be a conversion. But this is where I'm a little weak on what he means here. If previous generations accumulated their knowledge of the paradox, and it gave to the next generation, the last one, The last one would be in a final accumulation of all this. So I'm not really sure where he comes up with this idea about a conversion. So I just kind of left that with a question mark for anybody who has an idea of how he came to that. I know you probably didn't read it to that degree, because it was more my responsibility to come up with an answer there. But I just couldn't come up with anything that made a lot of sense about how the conversion fit into it.
I could think about it. I mean, about why the conversion would be. I mean, I don't.
Yeah, what's the
I
element of the conversion being an advantage there under those conditions? I mean, I'm not sure how a conversion fits in you if you've already come with the condition. How would even a conversion fit into the formula? That I just don't see.
Right.
Okay.
I could do some speculation, but I'm not sure how helpful that would be considering our time constraints.
Okay.
And we should probably try to bring this one to a close here. I think we're running up against a little bit of a break.
Okay. Well, we can kind of close it out on this point here then, and pick it up on. Or did you want to go a little further?
Yeah, I think we can get the comparison done. I think. Don't you think?
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. All right. I can get up to. Actually, I only have a couple things left here to do with this section. When it comes to a paradox, it's not something that we can be given to another generation as knowledge, but only in the form of the original paradox. So no inherited knowledge helps in receiving the condition of fate. So what he's saying there is, all we can do is tell the person the paradox, and it contains that element of faith and contains the element of offense. So we can't remove the offense to make it easier for another generation. It's not something that comes about through knowledge. So now he gives us section C, a comparison. When we try to compare one against the other, one generation against the other, we may not really understand that what might look easy to another generation was actually more difficult, and what might look difficult actually is something easy. Sometimes the ease of life makes faith more difficult, and hardship makes it easier. And that was kind of my conclusion of what he was saying there, is that when he says that you can't really tell by looking backwards and saying, oh, those first disciples, they walked with Christ. It was so much easier for him, right? Or so much easier for Paul, because maybe it wasn't easier for them. Maybe they had to give up a whole lot in order to have faith. Maybe it's easier for us, maybe right?
Yeah. I don't know if I would trade places with the immediate disciples, because that would mean likely being eaten by lions and crucified and all that stuff. And that sounds not so fun. Not so easy.
Absolutely. So we can try to claim that the earlier generations had an advantage, but maybe we're just making excuses for ourselves and for our generation. The thinking that, well, faith is really hard today. If they were in our shoes, maybe they wouldn't be Christians either. I'm not sure that we can actually make that assumption that faith is harder for us today. So in summary, my ending of this section here is, some might think that Paul had an advantage. He saw visions, he had dreams, he had appearances of God, etc., etc. But now let's look at what it was expected of Paul. He had to give up his freedom, his religious status as a Pharisee, his family life, his wealth, his future wealth. He really had no home. He exposed himself to robbers. He was beaten, left for dead numerous times. He was shipwrecked several times. And finally, he gave up his own life. Which one of us really wants to trade places with him? Now, perhaps in a romantic moment, I might say, oh yeah, I would, be glad to become Paul, but that would remain to be seen. So whether a person really wants to trade, we have to see. So God has a way of leveling our opportunity and our consequences. In my opinion, we would all come out even. Do I have it any harder than my neighbor across the street? If that's true, then my attitude is, then so be it. I shouldn't be concerned about those issues, how hard it is or how easy it is for other people to get into the kingdom of God. I should only be concerned with my own issues here. Only to serve God and surpass such thoughts, which are really just specious thoughts, what would we say, temptations, to think about compare my neighbor's life to my own. And so I can leave it there for now. That kind of finishes my summary, I think. And then section 2, it's up to you next week.
Yes, I'm back in the driver's seat. Well, I think you did a fantastic job, and I mean, as always, I mean, I think you're becoming a little bit of a rock star on the educational platform.
I don't know about that, but I always welcome your compliments, Luke. Thank you so much.
You know, I'll talk to you again. We'll probably talk later tonight about Robert and I are going to try something new. We're going to try to work through some French poetry together, something that's outside our comfort zone. So stay tuned for that. Yeah, we're going to be looking at the work of Charles Baudelaire. We'll see how that turns out. That should be a fun experiment.
Oh, well, we actually have a French. We're going to introduce somebody also, right?
Yeah. We have a mystery French guest to help us with the interpretation. So we've got so much coming at you guys. I've got, if you're interested, I've got some, I'll be discussing Nathaniel Hawthorne's The House of Seven Gables tomorrow. I've got some medieval history lined up. I've got poetry analyses. Oh, I hope you like knowledge, because I'm going to bring a lot of it to you. All right. So thank you for listening today. Download the Noetic app. Just support us right now by doing that. And just keep listening, keep learning. If you would like to participate in any of these educational materials that we're making, feel free to drop me a line at philosophyluke@gmail.com. And we'll get you. We can find I got work for you. I can get you involved. I'll put you to work. All right. Thank you, everybody. We'll be back with a thrilling conclusion of the philosophical fragments on Tuesday of next week. All right.
Bye-bye.